Negative utilitarianism is a concept that has recently got a lot of play on YouTube. And I wanted to just introduce some background on what negative utilitarianism is, where it came from, and a strong misgiving I have about it. The term negative utilitarianism was coined by Karl Popper in his 2-volume set, which he titled The Open Society and Its Enemies. It was published a long time ago in 1952. This is a quote from Karl Popper. I believe that there is, from the ethical point of view, no symmetry between suffering and happiness, or between pain and pleasure. Both the greatest happiness principle of the utilitarians and Kant's principle promote other people's happiness seems to me, at least in their formulations, fundamentally wrong in this point, which is, however, not one for rational argument. In my opinion, human suffering makes a direct moral appeal for help, while there is no similar call to increase the happiness of a man who is doing well anyway. The concept of negative utilitarianism was foreshadowed by earlier philosophers, and it has an obvious affinity with Buddhism. At first blush, negative utilitarianism appears to entail mass euthanasia. And it's sometimes portrayed here on YouTube as an appeal for mass euthanasia as well, which I assume everyone finds a little bit disconcerting, at least, or at least I personally do. But anyway, although this implication can be disputed by some advocates of negative utilitarianism for various reasons. Karl Popper was both a philosopher of science and a political philosopher. He's perhaps most famous for the falsification principle, a proposed methodological rule to demarcate science from non-science. Popper's negative utilitarian principle is that we should act to minimize suffering rather than maximize pleasure. Classical utilitarianism had explicitly argued for the moral symmetry of happiness and suffering. Complications aside, they supposed that increases in happiness and reduction in suffering are essentially of equal value when of equal magnitude. Popper disagreed. He believed that the practical consequences of the supposed moral symmetry were dangerous too. Philosophers should consider the fact that the greatest happiness principle can easily be made an excuse for a benevolent dictatorship. We should replace it by a more modest and more realistic principle, the principle that the fight against avoidable misery should be a recognized aim of public policy, while the increase of happiness should be left in the main to private initiative. Popper believed that by acting to minimize suffering, we avoid the terrible risks of utopianism, by which he had in mind the communism and fascist dictators of the 20th century. And this is a quote from Popper. Those who promise us paradise on earth never produce anything but a hell. A staunch advocate of the open society, Popper defended piecemeal social engineering rather than grandiose state planning. Ironically, and I agree with this completely, a full realization of a negative utopian ethic would depend inescapably on the utopian planning that Popper abhorred. Only a global bioengineering project of unparalleled ambition could bring about the eradication of suffering throughout the living world, not piecemeal social engineering. In seeking to liberate the world from the tyranny of pain, negative utilitarianism is no less totalitarian in its policy implications than communism or fascism, albeit on the surface seemingly more compassionate. It is ironic that Karl Popper could not appreciate that point.